Thank you so much, Jessica, and to Joe as well for inviting us. It's a real privilege to be here, and it's a real dream for me to be in this position of getting to ask Lucy some questions. Not to be too fangirl about it, but I've been a huge fan of her work for over a decade, since I had the pleasure of working in a definitely assistant capacity on her solo show at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh in 2008. I actually brought along a copy of the catalogue, which I was allowed to take home from the reading room after the exhibition finished, hence its lovely damaged top left corner. But I think there's a lot to be said for the preciousness of books and objects like books when it comes to talking about Lucy's work, and the way that she very often deals with historic artifacts and visual material really in a very kind of archival, research-based way. So if anyone wants to have a look at the book later, please just come and let me know. We haven't rehearsed this in any way. So we've got an order for images, but we may run out of time before we run out of images, so we're just going to see what happens. But to introduce, in a kind of very general sense, before I jump in with the questions for Lucy, I think it might be helpful to sort of say, first of all, that as an artist, Lucy always utilizes found images that emerge from these long periods of research. And she said that she never works directly from an object itself, but rather she uses instead secondary photographic or drawing or published source material that she can enlarge, copy, or simply break down into constituent parts. So her drawings, therefore, take on perhaps the status of a copy, or a reproduction of a reproduction, a working through of different systems of imaging. And she said in the past, something as static as an image can be seen to be constantly altering itself in relation to you and it. And also, interestingly, in relation to the last session before lunch, Lucy very clearly stated quite, again, early in her career that my drawings are always related more to sculpture than to painting. And when she started, her drawings were actually notes for sculptures. And that's where her interest in tracing and photographs came from. So I think there's a lot to unpack and relate to some of the discussions following Maggie and Ed's papers earlier. So we're going to start, back in 2005. So this was the body of work that you selected to begin this conversation, which is a series of drawings called Cells with Rules and Exceptions. And they were included in the show at the Fruit Market about 3 years afterwards. But I wonder, first of all, if you could tell us why you made this particular starting point for today.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. It's a pleasure. And also, Stephanie has made the PowerPoint, which is the first time ever that someone else has made the PowerPoint for me, so thank you. Yes, I wanted to start with this drawing because I remember when I was making it, I was interested in taking the prison cell as a subject matter. And I was interested in that because that's something that, as in society, exists as a kind of image. Like we have this fear of going to prison. So it seemed like this very kind of vivid image. But on the flip side, like if you were to be going to prison or be about to be incarcerated, you'd feel this kind of rising panic or adrenaline rush. And I wanted to make a drawing which somehow kind of intersected those two points. And because it was a cell, and because that relates to law in some way, I wanted to draw it with a very particular rationale. So the image is made up, the dark parts of the image are made up of stripes which are 0.5 centimeter wide, and they alternate in contrasting colors. So they are blue and yellow, or red and green. And those colors vibrate with each other. But I also put in exceptions to those rules that then appear like kind of blobs or voids in the cells. And when I was making it, I I felt like that was how you might see if you were terrified or panicked. So I wanted to have a drawing that kind of encompassed both the rational position and the exception or the irrational position, or just the moment of sensation.
And this second image is from the same series but a different drawing, but it shows in close-up what Lucy's describing. And I think that sort of bifurcation that you're talking about is essentially a way of following a set of rules, but also a way in your drawing always to accommodate the glitch or the kind of moment of breakdown in a system is something that seems to be a sort of path through all of your different work in the sort of material or medium of drawing, because it's not a kind of fixed position for you relative to your wider practice. It has this, I would say, maybe even ambivalence in your wider work. Would you say that sort of ambivalence of drawing is something that you cultivate, this ability to hold kind of perhaps contradictory states together as something that you're interested in?
Yes, yeah, I do think that I'm interested in that. I mean, I'm also, I think about these drawings, I think about them really as like a process of fabrication. Like there's a series of instructions that then just get played out in the drawing of it. And there are mistakes in that, like you might drop a stitch if knitting or something. And I'm not interested in trying to conceal that process. Yeah.
And so we've titled this conversation Looking at Drawing as Language, and I think perhaps what we're talking about in that sense is not any kind of direct equivalent to language, but it's rather a sense of those kind of structural components of which the syntax, the grammar, the vocabulary of a language would be a kind of equivalent in a sense, and that you're interested in both the constituent parts of an image and the total field. And so that oscillation between close-up looking like we have here and that necessity to go close to a drawing of yours, I think, is a very powerful impulse. And yet you seem to me always to be cultivating that wider, almost kind of landscape vista as well in your work. So that sense of movement in a kind of bodily sense. The freedom that we have to do that, obviously, in opposition to the incarceration that you're talking about with the cells, particularly here. But I think, for me, you don't approach drawing as something that's small or slight or preparatory. It's rather often the opposite, if you would say that.
Yes, I would say that. I'm quite interested in the kind of slippage between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. I think that also comes out a lot in my interest in print, that I'm interested in the moment that the print comes from the block. But yeah, I'm interested in making the drawing like the dominant thing, like the immersive thing in the room. And I think that relates to kind of pushing it towards embodiment that you might find in sculpture.
I like that idea of drawing as the dominant thing, because so often we are not resigning, but at least prepared to talk about drawing in very much a kind of subsidiary or preparatory position relative to something else, and you really flip that logic, so that often actually the sculptures are something that act in a supporting category to the sort of installation enveloping view of the drawing, which is quite a powerful impulse. So speaking of that logic, the enveloping, we have, I would say this is probably one of the first drawings of yours to do this, physically take over the space in a way that's quite disruptive spatially, and also creates this kind of field in the room, which certainly you could argue was quasi-sculptural. Could you tell us a little bit about this installation?
Yes, so this is an installation that I made, which is, I was just thinking about it before, as a kind of installation of encounter. It's called Leonora, and then it has subtitles that are taken from the kind of logic of tarot cards or like a game. I mean, they're not exactly that, but so this drawing behind is called Leonora brackets death, and then in front there's this sculpture is called the wheel, and what if I talk about the drawing first, maybe, it's a 1-to-1 scale drawing of a whale skeleton. It's made up of a very kind of precise system. It's 1 centimeter spirals with the good old Sharpie pen that are backfilled. All of the blank space left is backfilled with graphite. And the image is made visible by a smaller grid, which is inside the whale skeleton. So the image is just visible by the difference of density of the mark. But of course, like optically, it makes for like a space that floats behind. So the bones of the whale float kind of within the drawing in quite a weird way. What I was thinking about when I made that drawing was the kind of balance between the rationalization of kind of classification, because this is from a zoology museum, on one hand, and then on the other hand, the possibility of actually encountering a whale under the sea that might swim directly past you, and how those two things are kind of both feasible in some way. And I think one is like to do with knowledge in some way, and the other one is to do with sensation. And I put this one after the cells in this sequence because this is the moment that the rationale breaks between the method of drawing, the marks made, and the subject matter. So this is really quite kind of arbitrary, these marks. And the reason that it's called Leonora is because I went to visit the surrealist Leonora Carrington. So that's also part of this work. It's a film, 16mm film, which is just our kind of meeting. I went to her studio and filmed her hands. So in a way, I'm using her kind of legacy as a surrealist, and more precisely this idea that her experience of her interior thoughts and life is more consistent than actual history that she's lived through, because she lived through such a kind of turbulent time.
So again, and this is going back to Ed's paper, obviously, the delicate balance that exists within your work, especially when it's within a mode of installation where you're holding together a large-scale drawing, a beautiful, carefully made sculpture of wood, and then a 16mm film. There's kind of a lot of different temporalities at work, and one of those, I think, crucial temporalities for me is the time of making. And again, we spoke earlier about that idea of labor intensiveness with drawing, but the fact that you've held together two different systems of representation or imagery within the drawing, so that you have the representation of the whale skeleton and then also the representation system of the individual spirals of the Sharpie marks. You've got this kind of dual field emerging within the drawing, which in a way has this sense both of immersion, in that you kind of have to sink into that experience of the drawing, but at the same time there's a resistance there because you're not immediately revealing what the drawing is. It takes some effort, I would say, to figure out that there's a whale skeleton there. It's not immediately revealing to the viewer. And that kind of idea of difficulty within vision, of kind of a point of resistance or of forcefulness against the viewer, and in the way that you focus on Leonora Carrington's hands, there's something of that kind of reference back to that labor intensiveness of the drawing. Is that something that you feel is important, or are you interested in people thinking about the time that you invested into these works?
No, basically.
It's something that art historians are obsessed with, basically.
I am interested in that I personally went through the process of making that, because it seems like a kind of parallel to buying a plane ticket to Mexico and going to meet Leonora, even though I didn't have her consent or permission or anything. It was more to do with some kind of commitment on my own part to make something that I really wanted to happen.
To follow it through.
Yeah, but it is also quite, I think, a kind of irrational not exactly irrational, but it has a certain ambition to not quite play by the rules. And the drawing is kind of opaque, and there's something about the Sharpie marks that looks a bit like a kind of handwriting or a text that you can't read. And I think that in the work there's some kind of idea of an outsider position that's looking at things that might be much more rational from an insider position. So that moves us to the next slide, I think, because...
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a work that I made just printing sides of a chair, and I made it to try to look like a kind of linguistic, well, it's a sentence basically, but a nonsense sentence that's possibly kind of shouted really loud, like an utterance. And this was part of an installation that I made called Thames and Hudson, and I was interested in like what the kind of scope for sculpture or installation might be, and could I make a kind of sculpture of a publishing house? Like, how complex can you ask sculpture to be or installation to be? But there's also something quite kind of perverse about going through a kind of publishing house back to an exhibition, if you see what I mean. Like, it's a kind of circuitous route, but...
Indeed, and this was part of your Turner Prize installation in 2009. So can you tell us a little bit about how this work was made? Am I right in saying that it's a contact print?
Yeah, it was made by picking up a chair and literally like hopping onto the paper with the chair and then hopping back off again. And
it's remarkably crisp, because I would imagine that would have created something incredibly messy.
We were incredibly messy after. I did it with Courtauld was my assistant at the time, so she was
So you were covered in ink?
Yeah.
Okay. That makes me feel better.
Yeah.
I'm interested in, and this really leads us to the fact that a lot of the work that we're talking about today, you could argue it is more printmaking than it is drawing. And these, of course, you would say they're a monotype or a monoprint rather than a drawing. But I guess it's, for me and perhaps you, I'm imagining it's less interesting to get into splitting hairs about the kind of where a drawing might end and where a print might begin, and rather to think about both as different forms of media technology, reproductive technology, and the capacity for the self-generation or regeneration of an image. Because in a sense, you're dealing with that idea of the multiple always, because this presumably was the same chair, but in order to make the utterance or the sentence, you've had to reproduce it, you've had to multiply it as an object into this kind of category of components of language. And so I wonder really, do you make a distinction when you're embarking upon a work as to whether something is drawing or printmaking, or are you more concerned with the materiality of it? You know, what type of paper you're using, the scale, all of these considerations?
That's a tough one, because sometimes I am really interested in print as print. But I think I first began using print to just make the process of making these extremely labor-intensive drawings quicker, because I wanted to make them even bigger for the show in the fruit market. I felt that I have a bit of a problem with display. I don't like straightforward display. And there was this kind of danger that show in the fruit market became very much kind of drawings on the wall, and it was way too polite for me. And I remember having this conversation with Fiona Bradley about, I wanted to make this triangle, so when you come up the stairs of the fruit market, instead of being in the normal gallery, you're enclosed in this triangle of these black drawing presences. And Fiona said, like, oh, I can't believe that you've actually done this, because I tried so hard to stop you doing it. And I was like, I had no idea that she was trying to stop me. She should have been more blunt. But anyway, I moved into printmaking to enable that kind of architectural scale.
That's really interesting, I think, to think about, because in a way, again, this is speaking from a position outside that of someone who's an artist.
There it is.
That's perfect, thank you. See, I knew you would be able to take over the clicker at certain key moments. I think, again, we think of printmaking not necessarily as something associated with architectural scale. And for me, that is what one of the facets of your work that's so compelling is that sense of something where the drawing has taken on a scale absolutely beyond anything that we would imagine being produced by one hand, and it becomes something that goes beyond the sort of physicality of mark making and takes on something outside that of the body. It's not the scale of the body anymore, albeit we have the body or the skeleton of the whale, but there's something kind of slightly non-human about your drawing, which I'm interested in. And I think perhaps it's the way that the image is broken down to such a degree that there's almost that sensation of having severed it from the maker or the hand. And again, that I think is very helpful in opening up our considerations of drawing, with so much of the writing about drawing is concerned with that kind of idea of the mark or the line or the trace. And actually, you have to look very hard in order to find those things in your drawing sometime. You sort of don't make it easy. There's something of the way that the field can overtake that idea of mark making per se. Could you tell us a little bit about, this is obviously a larger work going on from 2 years from the Lineart installation. And am I right in saying this was made originally for Basel?
No, this was made for the fruit market.
This was made for the fruit market as well?
Yeah, it was one of the edges
one of the edges,
as you came up the stairs.
So I don't have an image of it in the fruit market, but
it was impossible to photograph.
Yeah, it's really tricky. But I really like this photograph because it shows you it on an oblique angle, and it shows you also another component of the installation, where I wonder if you could talk about this image, because it kind of goes back to that idea of complicating vision.
Yeah, so this was a reworking. I quite often rehang my drawings and either try to change what they mean or adjust them in some way to be shown again. I quite rarely just show them again neutrally. Anyway, so this is the drawing together with the skeleton that was the source material for it. So I made it when I was on residency in Basel, and they allowed me in the store of the Natural History Museum. So I photographed this skeleton, and then when I was invited to do the show in Basel, it was an opportunity to reunite the drawing print with the actual skeleton. But of course, it would completely negate the... I was interested in this kind of face-off between this kind of sculptural, almost heavy drawing that I'd made and the actual object. So then I made these screens so that you could only glimpse kind of little zips of the skeleton, and it was really strange in the room that it had so little presence, and then you realize that there's this giant body behind this wall.
And it becomes to seem more like a drawing than your actual drawing, because you, as you say, you're just getting these slivers of visual information where you have only this kind of quite graphic record of the skeleton, and you're not ever seeing the whole visual object. And I wondered, did that take some persuading for the curators of the Natural History Museum, or were they into this idea of exhibiting but concealing?
Yeah, they were really into it, actually. They were really helpful. It was nice.
Okay, so I'm just keeping an eye on time. Okay, so we're jumping forward a few years now, and we're showing this work because I guess you could say this is unique within your whole series of black drawings, because this work from 2015, untitled Black Drawing, is a kind of record of all of the previous work in this group. So we have a detail of it later on, which will be helpful, because I guess seeing it on a PowerPoint isn't doing the most generous looking for the drawing itself. But you have a kind of synthesis of all of your different visual cues for the black drawings, which, as you said, is the whale skeleton. And here it's been rotated 90 degrees, so it's the vertical on the right-hand panel. And you've also got the Hokusai Great Wave, which you may see faintly, sort of along the bottom. No, and is that rotated as well? The Hokusai?
No, it's coming up and over that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And then you probably can't see this, but there's also a kind of portrait of a man's head, which is based on a coin.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on in here.
There's a lot going on. So I made all of those individually as these black drawings. And so what I'm doing is just overlaying and making a kind of compression of all of the black drawings that I've made before, but on one, in one work. So at some point, I started to, like, almost I was kind of going forward in a particular direction, and then I did like a 180, and I started going back again. And the moment that I did that was when I went back to Leonora Carrington's house after she died. So I made the journey again, like the same route, and but with the knowledge that the encounter wouldn't be there. And I just took photographs of the outside of her house and then went back. But that led to this kind of retro period of working back through my own material as almost just like a new matter that I was encountering. So this is part of that move. Another part of that move was turning like abstract sculptures that I had made into animals. So I'd like literally made like ears and eyes for them, and this kind of undoing of your own
logic.
Yeah, or your own position. I mean, it's absurd to make abstract sculptures into animals, but
fortunately we don't have any images of those. I would just apologize. So I'm keeping in mind the time, and we want to eventually get to Available Fonts, which is the series of 10 prints that we showed in the group exhibition last summer at Modern Art Oxford. But first we have some images of earlier work from about 2008, which are based on banknotes, and that has a relationship to this more recent work. Can you tell us about these works?
Yeah, sure. I worked with a family who make prototypes for banknotes and passports, and they're actually fine art printers who have taken a sidestep into that. So they were really open to working with me, which was fabulous. But I was interested in this mark making. Instead of trying to describe something, it's just trying to make it unique and difficult enough, and that somehow chimed with me, like this kind of difficulty of reproduction. And so I made these banknotes with them that are kind of like my own money in some way,
which is amazing.
But I also became quite interested in like this idea of legitimacy, or like graphic legitimacy.
And that idea of these kind of tricks and ways to stop or obstruct forfeiters, really, for their purposes, the secure printmaking of banknotes and checks and things like that, that idea of providing blocks to reproduction and actually to make things harder to create copies of. I think that's a really nice circularity, bringing us back to this idea of uniqueness relative to drawing, because here you have a print that's trying essentially to be unreproducible by others, at least. And that sense of, in a legal sense, trying to avoid reproduction for criminals and such like. But also I thought it was funny this week, I don't know if you saw, the Australian Mint got into trouble because some of their microtext in the new $50 notes have been printed with a spelling mistake. So that's a printing error that's going to be going into the tens of millions of dollars to correct. But there's something there about how difficult it is as an endeavor, which is really compelling.
Yeah, I also like it in that it's kind of like a relic of a previous technology that we still have. Don't know how long we'll have it for, but yeah, it does seem like I'm quite interested in things that remain beyond their kind of logical end of their technological kind of period. I mean, like I'm interested in how things become available to slowly work our way around to available fonts, but I think that when mediums become kind of obsolete, there's this kind of period that they are suddenly available to artists in a slightly different way, like 35mm film,
Right.
or newspaper prints.
And that brings us to another series, which I saw at Tramway in Glasgow. I don't know if that's when you first exhibited them, but I remember in the vast space of Tramway, you again being asked to go very, very close to see something that looks almost blank from a distance, so something that's not quite fully into being as an image, and it kind of really forces you to get up close.
I actually showed them. I haven't ever shown them again.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I make a new series when I'm showing them in a different place. So the first series that I made was in Yale Union in Portland in Oregon, and I made the exhibition, when I was saying sometimes it's really about print, the exhibition, the spine of the exhibition were these giant lithographic stones that I got from Lithograph City in Iowa, which was like when lithographic stone stopped being imported into the US because of the war, of the First World War. They had to find their own lithographic stone, and they made this pop-up city called Lithograph City, which then was ploughed under by like 1950 or something. And so now there's almost none of it. There's some foundations left, but the quarry is now an aggregate quarry. So I got the guy to bring out these huge boulders of lithographic stone, and I just cut them to the best printing level and polished them, like prepared them, but they're boulders. Anyway, and I also worked with The Guardian, so they saved the plates from the printing for me for a specific period. So I say, can I have them for 2 weeks starting now? And so I don't know, obviously, what the news is going to be in that time frame. And I've got an offset litho press in the studio that is quite a basic one. So it's the plate goes onto the plate gets inked, and then it goes onto the blanket, and then it goes onto the paper. And when it's on the blanket, you can stop the press and you can wipe the ink. So they're kind of like monoprints. They're a kind of combination of newspaper prints and monoprints. So this is when Thatcher died, yeah, I kind of like the idea that they precisely date the show, and as you move backwards or you move forwards through time and away from them, your relationship to them changes.
Yeah.
And I think that has something to do with the kind of live element of making an exhibition and its inevitable kind of fading or changing.
Because these are obviously now historical documents for us, even sort of 6 years later. And whereas at the time of the exhibition, perhaps some people would have instantly recognised the image because they would have just seen it a couple of days ago. Now it takes some detective work to think, right, what could we possibly be looking at again? Yeah. So that process again, sort of our relationship to the image is constantly altering over time, which feels like a preoccupation in many of your works. I'm just going to quickly scoot through these so we've got time to get onto available fonts. Can you tell me what this is? Because I have no idea, but I really liked it.
These are the flowers from Margaret Thatcher's coffin.
Of course.
Of course. How could you not tell?
How could I? I thought it was actually like a sea anemone or something, like a sort of bit of coral, but now that I see their flowers, and that just gives you an overview. This is of I think a different week, is that right? Or 2 weeks?
Yeah. These are the ones that you saw in Tramway. So these ones relate to how long the show was on for. So there was a plate for every day that the show was on.
Okay. So I'm just showing here a detail from the black drawing that Lucy was talking about earlier, and that you can see more clearly the portrait head and the whale skeleton, but they are very difficult to photograph, I would say. That's one of the great things about your drawings, is that you do really need to see them in person, I think. And then that takes us to available fonts, which, as I said, was part of the group show that Modern Art Oxford worked in collaboration with Drawing Room, and Mary mentioned it earlier this morning. And when I asked Lucy if she would like to be in the show, which was broadly speaking kind of very partial survey of different modes of contemporary drawing as it was being used in various artist practices, she came back and said, "Oh, I'll show some prints." And I was like, okay. And I have to admit, first of all, I wasn't really sure if, what to do with that. And part of me was being very traditional in my sense of medium categorization. But they ended up being very, very important to the logic of the exhibition, and actually really shaped the way that we talked about the concept of the show as a whole, because it forced me really to rethink some of my assumptions actually on what drawing was doing or how it was operating within artist practice. And I think that was very valuable, in fact, and it was the only work that was quote-unquote printmaking in the show. But of course the entire logic of the work was in and around this body of drawings, because it relates again to the ongoing series of black drawings. And I've got a few different images of it because it's helpful to see a few close-ups, but I wonder if you can explain to us what people are looking at here.
Yeah, sure. It's not altogether obvious. So what you're looking at is that all of the black material is etching. It's shrunk down from my black drawing, and it forms like the kind of substrate or something. Mm-hmm. And then within it there are different images. There are ferns which are printed by Lowe, and they're the most incredible kind of encyclopedic. I mean, they're every fern in the world, and they're made with wood engraving. So they're made with this very limited range of. I think each one is four colors, or even 3 colors, and to try to express all of that variety that exists in those terms is like some kind of complete contraction, which is really amazing. And so I copied some of the wood engravings in wood engravings, and I printed them in kind of more urgent colors like oranges and yellows and reds. There are also banknotes from hyperinflation in Germany that are kind of underneath my printing. And there are, in certain places, there are pictures of wooden joins, which are also joins between images in the paper. So it's almost like a kind of sculptural type procedure, but in image, like they're helping it hang together.
And they are actually the individual plates. So you've got this kind of totem pole-like stacking of different horizontal plates as you actually printed the images. So it's not a single sheet of paper, but they've been joined together. Is that right?
Yes, they've been joined together, and they've got these kind of inserts that link them structurally. Yeah, so in a way it's almost like this kind of reduction of my own work into this much more kind of almost like stretched to falling apart logic. And
I just didn't realize this was in so soon, but the reason we have the Hilma F. Klint is because when we were first talking about this conversation, you mentioned having seen the exhibition at the Guggenheim this spring in New York, and being really captivated by the blue notebooks, which were something that Hilma F. Klint made as a record of all of her paintings of the temple, but many years after the fact. So they became like a ledger of her practice, and there would be a small black and white photograph of the painting, and then she would make this very detailed watercolor. So she was making a copy of the original, much larger work and creating a kind of archive of her own practice that was also a kind of annotation or a form of record keeping. And you said you sort of felt like there was this equivalency with what you were doing in available fonts, which was creating a kind of lighter or less important version of that imagery, not having the kind of scale of the immersive black drawing installations, but having something that kind of is about creating this kind of shrunken form of the imagery and kind of really zeroing in on all of these details. So you kind of shift back and forth between an enlargement of the Sharpie swirls and then actually much smaller scale versions of what we see earlier in the black drawings. And I thought that was a really lovely way of describing it, this relationship to what Hilma af Klint was doing. This is a terrible image, so apologies.
Yeah, I was really interested in these notebooks as this kind of idea of like an intermediary, like that you would have this almost like more carryable version to go, but it's still original and very carefully made by the artist.
Yeah.
It's some kind of acknowledgement of like how you're seen or what conditions the work is seen under. And I think that my available fonts are in some way like a kind of almost like a kind of condensed experience of what it was to look at those works or to make those works for me, and also this moment that we don't kind of go to very often in artist practice of when the meaning starts to deteriorate for the artist, or like when the show is over and the works are kind of, they go back into being kind of like contingent parts of something rather than an experience. And I think that that's quite interesting to think about and acknowledge, like this detritus or kind of compost heap.
I think compost heap is a great phrase to end on. Just looking at my clock and seeing that we should probably draw it to a close there, but I just want to thank Lucy for being so incredibly open and really just rich in the description of how the work comes to being, because I know that's is something that I find so valuable, and it's not always, we don't always bring the knowledge with us to know exactly how these things are made, and particularly the complexity of available fonts. I think it's rewarded when you see the unpacking of that materiality. So thank you.
Well, thank you too, Stephanie, for the questions.